joined. We've just started recording and we'll give it a minute to allow other people to join. So just bear with us, please. Thank you.
I can see the numbers slowly climbing, Julie, so I reckon we'll be ready to go at 1 minute past.
Okay, I'm going to kick off if that's all right. Very, very warm welcome to this Nous webinar. I'm absolutely delighted that you're able to join us for what will be the third instalment of our report where we sit down and discuss with professional services leaders what's on their mind, what they're excited about and what concerns them about the year ahead. I'm Julie Mercer. I'm a principal at Nous Group and I head up our UK practice. And it's great to have all of you on this call. After almost 2 decades of growth in the UK sector, we are now facing some big significant challenges. Not enough funding, changes student choice, demographics running against us, geopolitics really impacting what we can do, and of course, the broader political discourse that we're experiencing. So it's not surprising, therefore, that when we surveyed professional services staff this time round, over half of them felt that their financial situation would be much worse than it has been in the past. And this was particularly marked in the UK, although similar challenges, similar pressures being faced by colleagues right across the globe. So we're delighted to share with you this latest report. We've got about an hour to do that, and we will absolutely leave time for questions at the end of that. But as you think of questions as we go through the report, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll try to address them either at the end or as we go through if that's the right thing to do. But before we get into it, I'd really like to hand over to my colleague, Paul Taylor, who is the lead author for this report, just to tell you a little bit more about how the report came about and to kick us off in terms of some of the key findings.
Thanks, Julie, and hello, everyone. As Julie said, my name's Paul Taylor. I'm a principal at Nous. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal Ngambri country down here in Australia in Canberra, and I lead our work on professional services around the world, and so have led the research on this report, which has engaged about 55 COOs, CFOs, similar professional services leaders through a combination of in-depth long-term interviews and also surveys. So for decades, as Julie said, we've been operating in an environment sort of pre-COVID of sustained expansion, of trying to increase student enrollments, especially international students, growing our research ambitions, and and a steady rise in sort of capital investments. Now, and particularly this year, what we see is institutions confronting a new era, one where the rising costs, stagnant and declining revenues, and global uncertainties are really forcing financial constraint. And so I think that risk has been there on the horizon for maybe the last 2 to 5 years, but now it's really an urgent priority. And throughout this report, you'll see that sense of urgency, that sense of action from COOs across the sector in multiple different countries. Of course, individual universities are facing very different financial challenges. Some are more insulated from the pressures than others, but the trends are pretty clear and felt across the sector. This cost growth, these stagnant declining revenues, this global uncertainty is pushing, as Julie says, somewhat more than half of universities to say they're going to be in serious financial challenges in the short term. Maybe they've got 2 or 3 years worth of reserves, but actually the challenge has to be dealt with right now to ensure long-term success. And so professional services leaders have a critical role to play in this sort of turbulent times. And as we sit down with COOs, I think that sense of urgency, that sense of the importance of their role in leading this conversation, in leading institutional reforms, in choosing very intelligently where they invest comes through. And it requires universities to act decisively, both in the short term to sort of balance the books and handle the immediate challenges, but also to think about what does the long-term investment and change need to be for sustainability. And Julie's going to talk about some of the other work we've done around new paradigms of universities, but really this report focused on the here and now, focused on how a CEO is thinking about and now thinking around sound financial management in order to navigate universities through this point where they're feeling like they're on the precipice, which is, of course, the title of this year's report. Julie also mentioned we've had 3 years. So we started this report just after COVID, where we saw and heard COOs saying the role of the COO in a university has changed dramatically. That maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it was a simpler role. It was seen as a less strategic role by vice chancellors, by provosts, by boards. And now we're actually being asked to do different things, and our teams are being asked to do very different things. And throughout this report, we're going to talk about what does that changing role, those changing responsibilities look like for CEOs, and how are they talking about that. So the key findings we grouped into these 3 ideas. The first is, what does it mean to be a university professional service leader today in terms of leading in this changing sector? And Julie and I are going to tag team those themes underneath. One is about actually steering the ship. And the second is different forms of collaboration so that we can work across the sector and as a sector in these different times. The second sort of set of themes is about actually changing the institutions in which we work and lead. So driving those institutional wide reforms. And as you'll see, what it means to have an efficiency remit right now is quite different than even 18 months ago. And what it means to have collaboration across multiple portfolios in order to drive that broader efficiency remit is changing the nature and the focus of the COO role. And then finally, we always ask COOs, what are they spending their money on? And so in this theme, we're talking about how COOs are actually investing for the future, both through their thinking in terms of infrastructure and capital spend and managing the assets of the university. And also, what does digital investment look like? What does successful digital investment look like? And what does AI adoption mean for the COO role and for institutions? So we'll walk through a combination of some of the survey results, some of the quotes from our CIOs, and some of our experience over the next little while. So delighted to have you join us on that journey. And I'll take this first one, which is the theme around steering the ship. I think this came through very clearly this year in ways that it didn't in the past 2 reports, which was, while the role of university services leaders have evolved, really university leaders, professional services leaders had never said that it was their role to be the lead on transformational change. That yes, they were part of the picture, but this is about COOs stepping in and being in the spotlight when it comes to these transformational changes. And because of the nature of the change, the scale of the change, and the role of COOs, you can see this is sort of the most important area for professional services over the next 5 years. And what we see is that means that they're increasingly having to think about how do you educate a broad set of stakeholders and executives and leaders in universities around the situation universities are in today, and also what is actually going to have to change across the sector inside these institutions to be structurally sound long term. And so lifting that kind of financial literacy, that commercial literacy, is actually one of the big challenges COOs are seeing in this role of leading transformational change. And then the third part of this story is that professional service leaders are increasingly having to play a short game and a long game. And there's this real tension, and Julia will talk to this later on, about actually getting consumed by the short-term strategy, the short-term challenges. Is it giving the space for COOs and professional services leaders to think hard about the strategy and make big plays for what comes next? Throughout the report, we tried to quote as many of the COOs and university leaders as we could, nicely anonymized, so that we could get some of the good things. And so through this presentation, we'll try and give you a smattering. We've tried very hard to have one UK representative, one Canadian, and one Australian, which is obviously where Nous spends most of our time. And it also, I think, gives you a sense of both the different views from the different countries, but also where there's clearly thinking being similar across these different jurisdictions. So on the left, our UK COO, really, it speaks to this idea that I mentioned earlier, that perhaps COOs or professional services leaders 10, 15 years ago saw the role as running the ops, that when there was money around, that it was about spending it well on new things and about getting the operations to work well. But as revenue has taken this massive hit, as there's been this negative upswell of public sentiment, as life has got more complicated, so has the COO role. And in fact, the COOs, I think, across all countries have said, we are personally and legislatively responsible for an enormous amount of the things that are at the top of the enterprise risk register these days. And this middle quote then comes from from an Australian COO who I sat down with, talking about this problem, basically saying it's very lonely at the moment to be the only professional services leader in the executive, and often to be the only professional services leader talking to the board. Actually, a majority of these changes from government, health and safety, data, cyber, industrial relations are coming directly onto my desk. And I am having to shift what my role is to try and lift up and share that problem across the executive, to try and lift people's understanding of just how risky and how difficult this is. Because if I'm just trying to take these things and share them with my team, it's not going to work. And I think this is that sense, then when we get to the Canadian quote here, is that COOs are feeling a bit stuck in the here and now, and the here and now is no fun, and it's also very difficult. But we need to take a longer view that the future is something we need to talk about, because if we're not thinking strategy right now, then we're not investing in the future in ways that are going to set us up for long-term success. So this is kind of what it looks like for COOs to be trying to take, a more active role in steering the ship. But part of that is also, how do they bring other people across the sector into this conversation so they can understand what that looks like? And Julie, I'll throw to you for the next theme, which is around working as a sector.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much. And interestingly, Paul has talked a lot about kind of the role of the COO within the organization, trying to really show leadership and support leaders right across the institution to address some of the really big challenges that everyone is facing. But one of the other themes that came through was actually the leadership role at the systems level that professional services leaders can have. And I think we're very, very sort of blessed, I guess, in the UK to have organisations like AHUA and BUFDG, which bring together our leaders to think about different things and to kind of share the pain, to explore opportunities and to come up with solutions. But I just wanted to spend 1 minute really talking about another report that we published a couple of months ago, which Paul referred to earlier, looking at 4 future paradigms that institutions could consider as they thought about the role that they might play. And in this piece of work, we talked to about 20 vice chancellors who helped us to think about and to co-create some ideas about the way the sector might evolve in the longer term. So playing again to Paul's point around, we're very focused on the here and now, but actually the long-term future financial sustainability is equally important. And what was really interesting in the 4 paradigms that we sort of identified with them was that need for cross-institutional collaboration, interinstitutional collaboration. So from the regional revolution to the empowered communities, these were all examples of institutional strategies that were really focusing on their distinctive value proposition. So not being all things to everyone, but actually recognizing that there are some things that we're really good at. There are some things that our peers and our contemporaries are very good at. And how do we actually come together to support the economic future of UK PLC, to support skills development and research and innovation in the UK in this new global reality, to actually deliver what we need both in our place, but also at a national and a global level. So it's interesting that the themes that are coming through in both of the reports really, really do play to that sense of collaboration, both within the institution and outside the institution. And again, just a couple of quotes that came through in some of the interviews that we had, which I think will resonate with many of you on the call. This idea that it's very easy to say we're going to do something differently, but it's very hard to deliver on that. And part of that, I think, is around, there's lots of things that we're trying to do in the sector today that we haven't really got a huge track record of doing. If I think about the universities I work with, And that point around this 2 decades of continued growth. We've got many leaders in the sector today who've never had to deal with financial challenges before. They've enjoyed the continued increase in student numbers. You know, we had 9K fees, we had international student number growth. Then we had COVID, which despite its challenges actually meant we spent less money, but actually revenue still came in. And now with the impact of that and the changing politics, we're for the very first time, probably in 20 years, dealing with a situation where the finances are really, really tight. And so conversations around different ways of collaborating with other institutions came to the fore, not least mergers and acquisitions. But of course, the challenges with things like mergers and acquisitions they're not really mergers, it's generally a takeover and acquisition. And that's really, really difficult. Paul and I were just talking about an example in the FE sector, in Australia that Paul's working with at the moment, and just how difficult it is to get the two boards and the two chief executives to come together and think about this in a very, very positive way without a sort of a win-lose scenario coming to the fore. I think the other thing for me around this is in the UK, we've had some good examples of M&A over the last year or so, City St George's, ARU and Writtle College, for example, but we've yet really since Manchester seen a really large scale merger of two organisations similar to Adelaide, which is happening, of course, in Australia at the moment. One of the things I would say is that we very much focus on getting to the deal, getting to the position where the two organisations can come together. But what I would remind everyone is, of course, the difficult bit only starts at that point. The post-merger integration work is where the real value creation happens, and getting that right and thinking about that early on. This is just not a legal transaction. This is a bringing together of two cultures, two sets of products and services, two groups of students, two groups of academics, and really thinking about what you're going to do in the next 6 months, the next 12 months beyond that is going to be absolutely critical. And of course, we're doing this at a time when nobody really believes that there's a problem. So that second quote, I think, talks about it really well. And you may well have seen Times Higher picked up on this story earlier in the week. But there have been so many perfect storms that we're going to crash to the shore and cause great problems. And yet we've always survived. So I think there's a real role for senior leaders right across the sector to act together to kind of really describe and articulate the challenges that are being faced and the impact and why change is so important and so critical today.
Thanks, Julie. So we might have a chance in the questions to talk more about mergers and acquisitions. The new Vice Chancellor of Adelaide University just got announced this week, which is a delightful appointment. And I think the headline was that the combination of those two universities will make Adelaide University the largest teaching university, the largest number of students in Australia. And we already have some absolutely massive institutions. So it's a different kind of merger where you're talking about two world-class universities coming together to create, an absolutely huge institution for South Australia. But what I'll shift us to here is themes 3 and 4. And as I sort of introduced, these middle themes are really about what does it mean for COOs to lead institutional reforms within their own institutions. And I think managing the cost base is this critical short-term priority for many professional services leaders. Doing that without compromising on the institution's academic and social mission is no mean feat. I think there are more stories in universities of we sort of cut and then grew back and then cut and then grew back than there are almost any other kind of negative narrative around the COO portfolio and the leadership of COOs in universities. And so it's a tough job. And while universities are sort of showing a greater propensity at the moment to find efficiencies across the corporate, the support, the administrative services, the insight from this work and the insight from talking with COOs is that the financial difficulties and the pressure on the sector is meaning that areas that were sort of traditionally immune perhaps from cost cutting, or at least cost cutting was the last thing they would do, are increasingly on the table. And this is reflected in the graph, I think, where the fact that universities are increasingly looking at academic delivery as a site where they might pursue efficiencies, and I thought there was a great quote from one of the UK COOs that basically said, this is anathema for us, that we have been told we'll do everything before program reform, before academic reform, and now we're being told to come to the table and talk about program margins, to talk about reforming the portfolio, to talk about a smaller, leaner academic delivery model. And you can see in the shape in the slide in front of us that the dark blue really only 18 months ago, COOs were saying the tools we're going to use to balance the books is going to be increasing tuition fees, is going to be international enrollment expansion. And I say it was 18 months ago because it was smack bang before Canada and Australia and the UK all shifted their policy intent and made it very difficult for that game to be played. And now what you see is that removal of low margin programs is almost top of the list. And so you've basically got this combination of the academic side of the house and professional services side of the house. They are the key tools to balance the books. It's a cost side story. It's not a revenue side story anymore. And this was really borne out in terms of not just sort of addressing the so-called long tail of programs or courses, but really more and more talking about what does it mean to have holistic changes to the academic delivery model, such as rationalizing faculties and programs, adopting new pedagogies, new modes of deliveries. The number of conversations that COOs and us are having around, we're trying to inform our academic colleagues around what does it mean to break away from the 40-40-20 model? How do we do workforce planning if we don't make that assumption on the academic side of the house, is very new, I think, over the last year or two. And so that comes with not just the program side, but also the teaching administrative side. And so professional services leaders are being asked to lead on pursuing efficiencies across the whole institution, are being asked to contribute to these sort of teaching, administration, corporate services right across that. And relative to the sort of 2022, 2023 survey, we see a much greater willingness to go across the end-to-end life cycle of some of these services. And that was particularly evident among our UK respondents. And Julie, I might hand it to you to sort of talk about what that experience is like in the UK and what you're hearing.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, up until maybe 18 months ago, most of the focus of the work that we were doing with universities was on professional services, back office, and what I might describe as middle office in terms of the university, the sort of the professional services linked to academic support. But what we've increasingly seen over the last 12 months is an increasing interest in actually addressing academic, the core business of the university, and right sizing, getting the right size and shape of the academic portfolio in order to therefore drive more efficiency and deliver a much better service from professional services. So you can't do one without the other. One is the yin to the other one's yang in many ways. And a good example of that, I guess, about a year ago, we launched through our Nous Data Insights team, teaching effort benchmarking, which we were quite nervous about doing at the beginning because it was going right into the heart of what universities are all about, and really challenging the productivity and the impact of the academic portfolio. What has been really interesting there is just the demand to be part of that program, and also the really valuable insights that it's bringing. So rather than trying to have an argument within the university about why one faculty or one department is more is more making a bigger contribution than another, because the answer is always a very difficult one about this is how you have to do it. What's been really interesting is seeing just how different, for example, the effectiveness and the efficiency of, say, philosophy is being taught across a whole range of different universities, many of whom would be peers, would sit very closely together on the global rankings, but actually very, very different sort of requirements in terms of staffing levels and support. So I think that's a really interesting one there, absolutely. The fourth theme, which I wanted to go on to talk about really, is around collaboration yet again by default. And I think what's really interesting here is this is very much about, it's building on the points that Paul were making and talking about the fact that actually you need to be working across portfolio, both professional services and academic services. And I talked a little bit about M&A a moment ago, but actually you will recognize that just delivering shared services within an organization or getting some joined upness within a college, within an institution, it can be very, very, very challenging. Because actually all of this is not really about moving desks or moving chairs or changing the shape of an organizational chart, but it's very much about culture and change management, and really getting to the heart of kind of why people, what motivates people, how to make change happen, rather than just the mechanics of moving parts. So this cross-portfolio collaboration is absolutely essential in a constrained environment. And bridging that divide between the academic and the professional services is a big priority, and has become an increasing priority as we try to align financial services with academic mission. And cultivating a culture where actually you can have these conversations, where the data is clear, where people understand the impact of certain actions, and the equal opposite effect that has on others, is absolutely critical. And you can see that coming through here. We're not used to having to work at pace in universities. It takes a long time to get a degree. It takes a longer time to get a PhD. But actually, in the current environment, we have to be able to increase our pace, and actually deliver things in a much more agile way that actually allows outcomes and solutions to be delivered as they go. We've moved away from that sort of long 3-year program of change to actually needing to actually do things in short and sharp bite-sized chunks to actually show progress and to demonstrate that progress as we go. And we also know the second quote there from our UK COO, where seeing is not necessarily believing. You can show them the data, but they will find a way of kind of thinking about it. So actually having a sort of consistent, aligned strategy and single voice between the provost and the COO is absolutely critical in all of this, to drive that one university approach. Because without that, actually all of these changes that you're trying to deliver on will end up, as Paul said, leading to sort of a kind of boom and bust, sort of we get there and then we lose it, we get there and then we lose it, a repetition that actually drives change fatigue and skepticism right across the organization. And so in terms of what was really interesting, when we looked at this collaboration theme, and we looked at the highest priorities for professional services staff, so I'm going to show you 3 slides here just to kind of show you the theme that sort of jumps through all of this. But you'll see on this one, what we see here is a big drop, as Paul mentioned earlier, in terms of people thinking about strategy, because actually we're really worried about the here and now. We're in this sort of terrible place where we've just got to balance the books or make sure that we get to the end of the financial year. And so what's been interesting to me is actually that's translated into people leadership being still very, very important, but that cross-portfolio collaboration, as I've said, becoming very important, up 30 percentage points when we compare it to the 2023 report. And if I just take you to the next slide, you will see that there are 2 things here that we're trying to show, really. We also asked about what's the most important administrative services that you need to address over the coming 12, 18 months. And we also asked them about areas for investment. And what came up very, very strongly here is, as you can see, IT and infrastructure remain the top priority, but hot on its heels is this focus on support for teaching and learning. So how do we reorganize the way in which we support what I've described as that middle office, the things that we do because we're a university that isn't teaching and learning? It's moved away from the back office, the stuff that we do because we're an organization, to focusing on the stuff that we need to do because we're a university, because we have students as customers or as members of our community. And then the second one, in terms of investment, you can see that's very much sort of in the space of revitalizing program offer. So I think if you take all of this together, what we're seeing is a recognition that the old programs, the very, very long tail of modules and the huge choice that we've offered to students in the past needs to change. We need to reduce that. We need to simplify our portfolio. But at the same time, we need to make it easier for students to engage with it. And we need to make it much more relevant to the future careers, the future world that they'll be graduating into.
Thanks, Julie. So we're shifting into the back third of our report, which really talked about where are university COOs, CFOs, professional service leaders investing for the future? And we've sort of split this into two themes, and I'll explain why. In 2023, one of the major themes was we're being asked to invest in hybrid. We're being asked to revitalize the campus to get people back on these campuses to create these experiences for students, but we're also being asked to radically and very quickly flip those physical spaces inside the classrooms for hybrid learning experiences. And so there was this enormous pressure that COOs felt, knowing actually there's this structural deficit that we're sitting on, but we're spending all this money trying to create this hybrid experience. That is not the story this year. This year, it is very much that universities are sitting on these large, aging, and often underutilized assets that are costly to maintain, and actually, even with that push to hybrid, are still no longer fit for purpose, given modern teaching methods, given hybrid working trends for faculty and for staff members, and given our financial realities. And so while the theme in 2023 was hybrid, perhaps a theme in 2025 is actually the pressure to choose between the physical and the digital environment for COOs. So throughout our interviews, we saw COOs have this know that they have this important strategic role to play in managing and optimizing university assets and facilities, but it's mainly now about reduce costs, improve sustainability, use space efficiently, and create additional revenue channels through those assets rather than pushing towards the sort of learning experience. And this, I think, is the vexing issue. But it's not surprising, therefore, that sort of research infrastructure, as you'll see in other parts of the report, still comes out as one of the sort of top priorities. But really what we're seeing is conversations around space utilization, timetabling. If you can get out of these buildings, if we can kind of get people out of these buildings, what do we then do with them? We can't sell them. We don't seem to be able to repurpose them. How do we get creative in terms of using these assets well? And what you'll see on the slide is that through all of this, there's actually a decrease in capital investments over the last year. And so we see this idea that capital budgets are under pressure, that the assets that these capital budgets are trying to maintain are often not fit for purpose. And I think a lovely quote from our Canadian colleagues who lives in a very far north place was saying, with climate change, we are seriously at risk. We have 200-year-old buildings. We're now having 1 in 100-year events once every 10 years. Like, we are just one hurricane each, away from things being seriously problematic. We are managing assets that are not designed for the world that we live in. And I thought it was, lots of COOs kind of said our buildings aren't fit for the learning environment, but these guys were just saying these buildings aren't even fit for the world in which we're operating in. And what we see is then this final quote, which is from one of the UK leaders, saying, more and more, we're having to get creative and think of these physical assets in terms of being a revenue diversification strategy. We need to look at what we can do in terms of other new revenue sources, in terms of commercial opportunities based on the properties we hold. And so this idea that return on investment from assets, it has to become the focus, because if all we're doing is trying to cover our deferred maintenance bill, we're not moving the institution forward in any way. We're basically just kicking the can down the road. And Julie recently led a conversation around this, and I thought, Julie, maybe you can share some of these sort of strategies and tactics specific for our UK colleagues.
Yeah, and I'm sure people can read the key points on this slide. There's quite a few of them. I'm not going to talk through every single one of them individually, but I just thought it would be helpful to kind of sort of talk a little bit about kind of what we're seeing. I think one of the challenges around the physical assets, of course, is to sell or decommission them takes a long time, and unless you're in Bloomsbury or some other very, very sort of high value location, it's very hard to kind of sell them at a market rate that actually is going to deliver something. So I think you have to think of different things as well. That's not going to solve your near-term challenges, but actually finding other ways to partner, to create new ventures, to make that space available for other things is an area worth exploring, and looking to other sectors about the innovation that they have around leasing and partnership, etc. would be something worth doing as well. But one of the easiest things I think you can do, and I say easy very carefully because I know the data is not always what it needs to be in our institutions, but just democratizing the data about how the estate is being used, the cost it's incurring, the impact it has. So that's very, very clear and explicit to colleagues across the institution can actually have a massive impact on kind of how people consider it. So what is the contribution to your cost base of the assets that you're using? And how might you reduce that as you drive towards targets around contribution levels and other things? But it also means you can start to look at the underlying root causes and actually get to the bottom. So quickly we turn to timetabling as being the solution to everything, but actually often it's not the timetabling, it's some of the sort of policies, the procedures, the rules, the sort of, I guess, the myth and legend that has built up in an organization about how space is used and who can use it. So really just trying to get to the bottom of that is really important as well. And of course, just making it really easy to book space and really difficult to use space that you haven't booked, for example. So there are some quick wins definitely in here that actually starts to get people to really understand. And then you can start to think about how do you consider the longer term integrated planning so that actually space is used much more effectively. And also, of course, we've got the sort of high cost of net zero, which, Paul, if you think it's a challenge in Canada and Australia, you know, we've had buildings in our sector for much longer, and they also need to be brought up to modern building standards and supported. So really thinking about what you can do in the near term as well as in the long term as well. I'm very happy to answer questions towards the end on this or any other thing that we've raised or talked about in today's conversation. But the last theme, but no, by no means the sort of leaving the sort of the least to the end, is this sort of whole question around AI and digital. And as Paul noted, we're still spending on estate, but we're increasingly spending on digital as well. And actually, over the last 12 months, you know, that has continued to be the case. But what we're also hearing is that in many cases, the investments that universities have made in digital has been disappointing. So we've spent a lot of money, we've ran big change projects, and we've delivered, and we've spent a lot of money, we've used a lot of time, but actually often those projects take longer to deliver less than we expected, and cost far more than we ever anticipated. And so how do you break that narrative? One of the challenges, I think, for this sector is that it's had a big technology deficit just to get up to sort of what people expect when they come out of the school system or out of the college system to be modern IT systems has been an effort for many institutions. So getting there first, but actually fundamentally, I think many institutions treat digital and AI as technology projects, when in fact these are big major change projects. So it's very easy when you've got to pay the license fees, when you've got to get the kit in, those are the things when the budget gets tight that you continue to pay for. And then we forget about the training, the change management, the hearts and minds, the cultural shifts, the ways of working that are going to need to be different in the future. And spending time thinking about that and investing in that is something that we really need to do much, much more of going forward. So treat every project as a major change project and put the right investment into bringing people with you on that journey and supporting those new skills development is absolutely critical, rather than just putting new technology on top of old technology is still old technology, and so will not work and will not deliver the changes that you need. But I wanted to finish off because the other thing that came through in our sort of third theme, our sort of sixth theme here, was around the role of AI and automation. And similar to Paul's point, when we published the last report, no one quite expected the big shift in sort of government policy around international students and immigration, nor did they expect ChatGPT to change their Christmas. And so since that sort of November, December, 18 months ago, the role of AI has just been everywhere, as you know. So it's not surprising when you look at this graph that in 2023, leveraging AI and automation didn't even appear on the list of things that people brought to our attention as stuff that they wanted to do. So I thought it would be timely to look to the next 5 to 10 years and think about what might be in this report over the coming years. And as you can see, Administrative efficiency, service efficiency remains very, very important. But we've had a big shift, as you can see, from improving on-campus experience to really thinking about how you leverage AI and automation. Do you want to be pioneers in this new world or fast followers? Because I don't think you can be laggards. I think you're going to need to move quickly to take advantage of this, not least to reduce costs and to deliver much more efficient professional services, but also some of the academic support services, some amazing use cases coming through from this sector and other sectors, which would have application in terms of marking and assessment, in terms of timetabling and supporting student services, but also, of course, in those high volume, repeatable transaction processes that happen maybe not every day within a university, but certainly on a regular basis. So really thinking about the role that AI can play right across the institution is something that we think we're going to be exploring more and more over the coming few years. I'm going to pause there. We've sort of come to the end of the big findings, the things that Paul and I thought were interesting in terms of the report that we've just published. And I'd love to open up to the audience, to all of you, to see whether there's anything that piqued your interest or any questions that you might have to ask. Thank you.
And I'll just say for those, the chat function is I think disabled. So try and use the Q&A box, and then Julie and I will be able to see it pop up, and we'll be able to work through the questions. So Julie, I've got one for you while people are typing away. When we did this in Australia, the question was, who's doing this well? Who's doing all of these changes? And particularly the interest was in terms of shared services, in terms of sector collaborations, who's doing it best? And so in the UK, what are the examples that you can think of where you can see these creative ways of being able to deliver in different models that COOs are sort of talking about?
That feels like an unfair question, because I'm either going to pick on someone who's in the audience or upset someone who's in the audience, Paul, by answering that question. But I think there are some really interesting things that are happening, actually. Oh, we've come off the screen. I can see Paul in much better now. I think so. So, for example, there are some really interesting coming together of delivery programs in some institutions. We've got a really lovely example, actually, where there is joint medical schools or joint business schools or joint vet schools between different institutions, so the institutions come together to genuinely deliver a joint program, which is very exciting and very interesting. We've been having conversations around, so lots of universities have sort of thought about a common first year for example, engineering. But actually, we're starting to explore conversations where groups of universities might feel that actually that first year program is less of a competitive advantage in terms of the content. So why are we all designing it at the same time? And actually having some really interesting conversations about how you develop some of that together. I think the interesting question around shared services, I did a report actually for UUK back in about 2011, 2012. Where we looked at shared services, and I keep saying I'm not sure we've moved on that far in that time for various reasons, but there is definitely big opportunities for universities to do more in that space, particularly those universities that have got very tight margins or maybe smaller and are actually looking. So we have lots of conversations where they're looking for organizations where they can sort of partner together to deliver on all of that. So I think the opportunities are there. I think in the UK, we've been quite slow to take advantage of some of those opportunities. I'm sure people on the call will have some examples, which they very welcome to add to the list of questions.
Brilliant. We've just had a couple of questions come through. The first one, I think, is a really good observation around, given the major shift in what COOs need to deliver in this mandate, what should we be considering when we're recruiting and designing these roles, and maybe, Julie, extend that to and their direct teams in order to sort of create the capability that's needed for the modern university COO?
Yeah, I think that having experience of having delivered change in complex organizations, not necessarily in higher education, is a really important part of that role. I think you do have to get the balance in the team between HE expertise and change and transformation expertise. So I wouldn't be, I'd be, we're funny fish really. But I think that is one of the things that we need to do is we need to make that balance. But I think it has to be individuals who are self-starting, who can act as a team, who have resilience, who can articulate and build business cases and bring people with them on those business cases, and who've got really good practical experience of having done this somewhere else before. So I think that's the key for me. It's that combination of HE and broader experience and actually deep change expertise where they've actually been at the coalface.
Thanks, Julie. I'll add an experience that I had recently. I had the pleasure of being asked to join in on a recruitment panel for a university COO, which it was the first and only time that I've heard of a consultant being asked to do it, which I felt very blessed to do. But I thought it was an interesting shift in as we talked about what's the university looking for, and they said, because we're not thinking that the next few years are going to be about revenue growth, and frankly, we're in the habit of thinking all things can be solved because of revenue growth, what we're looking for is for COOs who can deeply understand the true costs of operations and can deeply help us think about how we change that. And so that was a question then was, well, does that need to be someone who comes from the sector? And we kind of said, maybe, but not necessarily. There are extremely good leaders and COOs across universities that have come from outside the sector. But I think it's that attitude of saying we should be recruiting and designing these roles with that financial and commercial acumen. They need to be absolutely expert in deeply being able to deconstruct what the cost base of a university is, talk to the university about that very credibly, and they also need to be really good risk managers. This is a complex regulated environment. They need to be able to think about the true cost of operations within that complex environment that's only getting more difficult. And so I think those are the kind of characteristics that boards are looking for, and I hope that vice chancellors are looking for, so that they can turn to someone on their leadership team and say, let's really understand and help us understand how to deconstruct this problem, how to build it up from the ground, how to rethink how the operations will really work.
That's very good. Yeah, love that. I'm going to pick one up here from Tom, actually. Hello, Tom, who has sort of commented on the 23 to 25 trends being kind of what we're experiencing. So looking to your crystal ball, Paul, because I'm sure there were other things that came through in the conversations you were having with leaders around what might be coming down the road.
So I'll give three that I thought were the most that I think are the most interesting conversations happening right now. I think more than ever before, universities are saying the disruption we're going to get isn't from inside the sector, it's from outside the sector, and that our biggest competitors are actually going to be, ASU going for 250 million students, are actually going to be an edtech startup. So we shouldn't really be thinking too much about the people that exist in the UK sector or in the Australian sector and thinking, how do we squabble between the domestic students? We should be saying big, serious things are coming for us. And if we're not alive to that and thoughtful around that kind of disruption, then actually we're going to become irrelevant. And I think that the corollary to that is COOs saying, if we think about what that means from a sort of pricing point of view, is that you're going to get this bifurcation. So you're going to get the sense in which students are either going for, I'm happy with the online experience, I can shop anywhere in the world, and I'm going to be pushing the price down and leaving sort of UK institutions so they can go there, or no, I'm looking for a true learning experience, what many of our sort of high school students are looking for, which is, I want to be on campus, I want to have the backpack on, I want to sort of meet friends, I want to sort of meet people who will be my future employers, I want a sort of very engaged experience for multiple years, and that becomes the premium product that you can only get on a UK campus. And so how do you think about which way you're going to go? Because getting stuck in the middle is going to be a real problem. And then I think the second one is probably that there's going to be less focus on discipline-specific programs and degrees and designing universities around faculties and departments, and there's going to be more around non-disciplinary. And what does that mean for assessment? What does that mean for just all the processes and systems and things that we've built around the assumption that faculties and departments are the way universities are constructed? It's going to raise a ton of questions around how you run the operations of a university if you sort of care less about disciplines.
Really interesting observations. And I think the other one that I would just add to that is that sort of, which sort of builds really on what you've said, is this sort of this idea that actually, universities have grown over the last 20 years by being all things to all people. I sort of said that earlier, everyone wants to be a large, comprehensive, teaching and research intensive institution. While there are too many universities that look too similar in the UK to be able to really sell what they do in a way that actually attracts students. So, actually there's two things for me. One is actually figuring out what is your distinctive value proposition and really being confident to hone in on that and focus on that. But it's also, and I think this plays to your point around discipline versus interdisciplinary type capability programs. Actually, universities have historically tended to sell what they make rather than make what they can sell. And so I think there will be a real shift in thinking about what is it that our students need and want, what do our employers need and want, and understanding where you play in the ecosystem and how you can really optimize for that, I think will require quite a bit of strategic thinking. So I would hope that when we do this survey in 2 years' time, that strategic thinking will have reappeared as something that people are now paying attention to. We'll have done all of the hard cost out work, but actually now it's about how do we create a contemporary modern university system for the late 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I'll give one more example, but I think it's a bit Australian, but I still think it might be useful to share, which is I expect in sort of 18 months when we do this again, that there'll be a conversation around government is more involved, not from a necessarily a regulatory standpoint, but from actually managing the system or trying to manage the system in a different way to how Canada, the UK and Australia has thought about it before. And so what does it mean to be a COO in a managed system? What does it mean to be a leader in a managed system? Maybe that's going to be being better advocates to government, but I think it's actually going to be about that there's different tools available, that there's different levers you're going to pull, and there's also levers that you thought were previously available that are just not there anymore. And I think that will be, I suspect, a theme that's coming out. And even if you look at the US, while it's not being done in a very thoughtful way, I think it is. You can see a government trying to grab hold and manage a system, and just the complexities that come with that. And I think there will be themes across many countries where governments are more and more involved in that. And so, how do universities think and respond thoughtfully to it?
Yeah, and I think that then, I mean, if we go back to the first question about what are the skills and capabilities, actually that then opens up a whole other set of skills and capabilities around systems leadership as well. Because I think one of the things that, and I think this would be true in Australia and Canada also, is we've kind of fallen onto the back foot when it comes to the public discourse around our universities. We're already starting from a position where people really don't understand or value the role of universities. Our license to operate is at risk. And so if that's the case in the future, that there's going to be an attempt to be much more managed, then COOs, vice chancellors, other leaders within the universities will need to be institutional leaders, but they'll also need to be system leaders as well. And I think finding a way of doing that over the next 18, 24 months is going to be something that I'm sure we'll continue to grapple with.
Brilliant. We've got a question here, and it's building on the point that we made around COOs are often being the only professional services leader on the exec. Do you see a trend towards this changing? Do you think it needs to change to bring a different skill set, experiences beyond academic beyond the academy onto the exec and to successfully drive change and transformation programs. Julie, maybe you have a go at this one, and then I
Yeah,
might
yeah,
add.
I think it's a really, really good question, actually, really interesting. And I think from my perspective, a couple of things really. I think in the UK, we are sort of, it depends which part of the system you're in, as to whether the COO is the only role on the exec or not. I think and I think that is changing. And I think it probably needs to change depending on where you are in the sort of cycle of sort of financial sustainability. So, we need, at the moment, I think there's a really important role for the COO, the CFO, and the CPO on that senior leadership role. And those three leaders working really hand in glove to really drive transformational change. But I'm also, I look at the exec teams in many universities and think, my goodness, they're huge. How on earth do you manage with so many people around the table? And I think if you look at really successful change in any sector, it tends to be driven from a small, tightly knit group of individuals at the top of the organization, who then work with their direct reports and their direct reports to actually make change happen. So I do worry a little bit that actually the question is less important around whether the COO sits in the exec or not, but actually whether the exec is too unwieldy. And that's an interesting conversation to have, I guess, with your vice chancellor and with your board. But I think having that combination, that right number of people with the right skills, both on the exec and on the board, actually, is really important. And I think there's a lot more universities could do to really get a much richer suite of capability on the board and think differently about how they use their council, their board, to actually help them to deliver change within the organization. So I think it's a bit horses for courses, but I think in times of challenge, less is probably more. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the one thing that I'd add to this conversation is that I actually think the commercial and financial acumen of deans is going to be the test of whether universities are very successful. I think sort of bringing in creativity from outside the sector is absolutely critical, but I think the role of deans in these kind of sort of cost pressure scenarios becomes one of being a true general manager. And so being able to build the capability of deans, not just to bring their academic experience and expertise and global connections, but to actually say, you're going to have to really think deeply about this and understand these concepts that we're talking about and be out the front there talking to your academy. You're not going to be able to kind of stand the idea of saying, when someone says, oh, we can't think about margin, that's a for-profit thing. You're going to have to say, no, that's a thing that allows us to reinvest in the future of our institution. So deans leaning into these financial conversations, because that's what's going to enable the mission. What's going to enable them is going to be part of this story. So I think it's easy to say that what we need is sort of more outsiders in. I think that's a good thing, but I actually think what we need is deans being built to be these incredibly capable leaders. And then what you see is then as they move into roles, move into the executive, you see vice chancellors, you see provosts, you see DVCRs with a much deeper understanding of the commerciality and how to actually make a university run in very difficult times. So I think both stories need to happen together, and I think that there isn't sort of a simple solution here, but I'd love to see more of the how do we bring this capability up through the academy to really understand this side, as well as how do we bring new and interesting and disruptive talent in from other sectors that have done the type of things we're trying to do.
I think that's really good. And I think just building on that is the really interesting, do we need to rethink the way in which deans are appointed and then unappointed, that sort of 2 to 3 year sort of rotating door that often happens within some of the roles, actually. That makes it quite hard when you've got to go back into the team that you're working with as one of the team to kind of make really tough decisions when you're in charge. So I think there's some really interesting structural challenges, both in terms of kind of how that role is set up, but also, as you say, nobody, there's no other industry where you get a leadership position and have never had leadership support and training and expertise as you go along. And I think that's another area that's really very helpful as well. We are 1 minute to midday, which is phenomenal. The hour has gone through so quickly. It's been fabulous having The questions come through. We're very, very grateful to everyone who's joined the call and who's listened into the conversation. We do want to keep this conversation going. So if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to chat through any of the points that you've heard today or anything else that you've read in our report that you'd like to understand a little bit more, do please get in touch with myself or Paul, and we'll make sure that we sort of come back to you on all of that. But I would just like to say a massive thank you to everybody who has joined the call today. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to share our report with you, and an absolute thank you to Paul for staying up very late from Canberra and for doing such a great job in authoring this report. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.